What do you know about politics? What should you know? Forget views, beliefs, and opinions. Politics is really a science, and that's where we come in. Welcome to Inside Political Science. I'm Kirby Goodell.
I'm Todd Kent, and we're your guides to what's actually happening in politics. We're using our years of experience to navigate political data, media, money, behavior, and more to educate and inform you.
Welcome to Inside Politics, Episode 6. Todd Kent is off in Europe with a group of Texas A&M students. I'm Kirby Goodell. I'm a professor of political science here at Texas A&M in the Bush School of Government and Public Service. Thanks for watching. Thanks for subscribing. We appreciate your feedback and your insight. If you have questions, please send them to Inside Poli-Sci, Inside P-O-L-I-S-C-I at tamu.edu. And we'll try to address your question on the very next episode. Today, don't worry, you're not just going to have to listen to me talk the entire time. I brought in a guest, an expert on politics, congressional elections, Southern politics, how public space is used in democracies in order to help advance democratic goals. My good friend, my co-editor, the Hoffman Chair of American
Ideal
at Texas Christian University, a former professor at Oklahoma University. You were at Oklahoma for 30 years?
Almost.
So we're ready to go. Keith, the first thing, so some people, hopefully people were getting some repeat viewers and they understand how the show works, but we start off with the quick takes. These are the appetizers. We're laying out the meal, little quick bites of things we've watched and we've observed in the election, or things that are going on that caught our attention. First thing, I'll throw it out there just for you. Hunter Biden, guilty. The justice system works and it's fair to both sides, right?
Evidently, and evidently having a minor weapons charge is functionally equivalent to overthrowing the national government. So, or possibly more offensive. Okay, but yeah, that's okay. Yeah. I mean.
Yeah, no, it's fascinating to watch the immediate reaction. There are people, I was, of course, joking a little, but there are people who immediately said, well, that just shows you the justice system works. Okay, that might be taking a little far. And then on the other side, there are people who are saying, it's a smokescreen for the real crimes. They threw Hunter under the bus because they want to protect the real crimes committed by the Biden. It's remarkable what people will say in contemporary politics.
Well, it is. And you'd think that, you remember back in 1988, Joe Biden had a brain aneurysm and they did surgery and then he got hair plugs. And I swear the next thing is going to be, well, they put a chip in his head, right? It's always a conspiracy. It's always non-provable. But it's also always designed to justify the subjectivity you want to have out of the process, right?
Yeah, and
it's what we do.
Yeah, and we're making light of it a little bit, but there really is a serious body of research on conspiracy theories and what leads people to believe conspiracy theories and how resilient they are to actual evidence. So a conspiracy theorist quickly takes whatever happened in the contemporary world and just just pulls it into the conspiracy. And if you don't understand it, well, you're part of the conspiracy.
Exactly. And, the poli-psychology Jedis will say, the cognitive dissonance is strong with these, right? It's very strong with these. It's actually a real problem because we have a whole theory of politics predicated on the notion that people will somehow actually work from the same information, the same knowledge, and the same facts. We don't do it anymore. And I'm surprised we're so shocked by it.
Yeah, and it undermines faith and confidence in institutions, faith and confidence in democratic processes, all the things that you need, the sort of goodwill that you need for a successful democracy to function. These sorts of conspiracy theories really are a problem.
Yeah, and that really is the heart of the challenge, is that we need these institutions to function, which means we have to have faith that the mechanisms we use to control them are going to be legitimate.
Yeah. So on a different subject, I picked up, you probably saw this, Nate Silver at 538, a lot of political scientists. He really drives them crazy because he's not a political scientist. But he offers plenty of political science types of evidence in terms of what he does. He's a statistician. He's come out with his first forecast of the election. And he has what he does is he takes in the fundamentals, what's going on in the economy, what's going on in terms of polling, and he pieces the evidence together, and he runs simulations, and essentially over a number of simulations, Donald Trump wins 47% of the time. Surprised by that?
Well, not especially because, if you think about it, one of the things that Nate did that's a change from previous historic models is he's gotten in a more functional way of measuring the economy, so it's operating more in real time. All the old models that people like, people that trained with his dad, Brian, who was a political scientist at Michigan State, they all looked at things like third quarter GDP, right? And GDP growth, which is a very static measure, it's a clunky measure. You need to have information that responds in real time. And right now, economic fundamentals work against a Democratic president, as you'd expect. We've got, even though it's not bad inflation, it's the worst inflation and price increase we've had in 4 decades.
Yeah. Yeah. Now, the Economist also put out a forecasting model, and in their forecasting model, they have Trump ahead by Trump wins 63% of the time, or 66%. I think it's 63% of the time. And Biden on the other side of that, but they use a slightly different model. What they are doing is they're weighing the polling averages differently. And this is something that I think is really important. When people look at this, they're, the models tell you anything. Well, no, they don't. That you have to build in assumptions. If you look at just the fundamentals in the Economist model, Biden is slightly favored. He would win roughly 50.5, 51% of the time. But when you add in the state polling averages, then they have him losing, and especially having a hard time because he's got a narrow path to an electoral college victory.
Yeah, and the thing is, it's June. It's June. It's very early. A lot of this isn't going to get set. Is not going to really set in place until October. And if we look back in the distant past to 2016, remember 2016? A time before pandemics and our privilege of going there. Hillary Clinton had this incredibly high probability of winning going into the last 2 weeks of the campaign. Silver's models, which were using they used information across states to kind of balance and smooth out some of the errors in state-to-state polling. There's this thing called Markov chains we will not get into, okay?
Thank you.
But, basically the recent past is supposed to inform the recent present, the recent future, right? That's essentially, it's kind of like looking out the window at the weather anywhere except Oklahoma, where it changes every 10 minutes. Okay. But this idea that somehow the probability now is baked in, 63% scenario wins is basically a coin flip at this point, right? Because so much of the campaign hasn't happened, so much room for movement in the economy in particular, and also plenty of room for things to happen to the credibility of both candidates.
Yeah, and the polling data, I mean, the polling question, which we've talked about on a previous episode, it also asks the question what if the election were held today? Well, the election is not being held today, and so you can offer a much different answer today than you might offer in November. And in politics, a month is a lifetime, right? Lots of things can happen.
Yeah, and the thing is, what are these data really about? They drive interest, right? They might give us some indication, when we look back historically, about how things move, but so much politics in the United States the last 25 years is really a mobilization game.
Yeah.
And mobilization in demographics, fractional moves around the edges. Big question mark is what's happening with Latino voters, especially Latino men. That's been the question mark for 8 years. That's why the Democrats aren't getting traction quicker in Texas than they expected. For example, I get to know about Texas now. I live here now. But it's this thing is, it drives interest, right? It's good for fundraising. It's good for driving activist interest. It's good for ticking people off also, and getting them mad and then they tune back in and give us eyeballs.
Yeah, in a world where you're trying to get clicks and views, it's a fantastic way to drive people to a site. Yesterday we had some primaries, and one of the interesting things that came out of that for me was it seems like maybe the Republican side has learned not to take the most extreme and experienced candidate. In a number of different places, this was the case where they endorse someone with more political experience, maybe a little bit less MAGA in terms of in terms of their orientation. But one of the things that really caught my attention, because I think it's fascinating, given that we have two presidential candidates who are elderly, North Dakota passed an age limit. And so they're saying there is now, and just to be clear, I mean, I know sometimes people will say, oh, that's ageism to limit people in terms of how old they can be to run for office. Well, we already limit people in terms of their age in running for office. We just keep young people from doing it. Right. And now North Dakota is saying maybe we should put a cap in terms of how old people are. And I believe their cap was 81. But the age itself is maybe less important than this idea that maybe we should think about whether there's an upper bound in terms of when we should allow people to continue to run.
When you think about it, there's an experience problem, especially in the U.S. Senate, right? I think it's something like, is it 70% of U.S. senators were born before 1960, right?
It's something like that.
And
yes.
and so the contemporary human experience is very different. But these baby boomers in particular have been in these positions of power for a very long time. And I think there's a real desire to kind of nudge them out of the way and make room for the generation that comes after ours. Gen X, we're not getting a shot, right? That's okay. That's fine. That's, we get the last good retirement, and that's about it. But the idea of getting contemporary experience in there, we set those lower age limits at a point where there'd be minimum wisdom, right? Minimum wisdom. And there's no evidence that wisdom is really growing once you get past a certain age. So maybe easing people out of the way is not a bad idea. There's been talk about doing this on the judiciary also. A lot of law firms make partners age out at 65, so they take senior status and they're moved out of the earning pool and they become off counsel. We retire airline pilots at 65. We move a lot of people out of the way when the tools start to dissipate. And U.S. senators have shown a marked capacity to have dissipated tools in their 80s and 90s. We've got ample evidence, right?
Yeah. And to want to hold on to power. And I've joked as a college professor, I think a college professor is one of the greatest gigs ever. I feel absolutely blessed to have this position and to be here. And you're going to have to drag me away from it. I'm not leaving of my own volition. Someone's going to have to make me go. And I understand that. So I see the parallel in politics. If I were a U.S. senator and I loved being a U.S. senator or a member of Congress, I would not leave. Why would I leave? It's what I do. It's who I am.
Well, I remember, I retired from a faculty position because they had an even better one waiting for me. That's the only reason to go, is that there's an even better gig waiting around the corner. But this is a problem. It's actually a true problem because we've got large numbers of voices, people who are doing things in this world who don't feel like they're represented, and that only drives the resentment further.
Yeah.
The experience curve between a lot of lawmakers in particular and their constituents just keeps growing.
Yeah.
And we need Papaw to retire.
Yeah. One other there were a number of interesting results yesterday, but one of them that really caught my attention and got some media attention was the Ohio 6th congressional district. Mainly interesting because it was a Trump district. Trump won it by 29 points. And in yesterday, the Republican did win, but they won very narrowly. They greatly outspent their opponent. Their opponent was a waiter who spent like $25,000 and nearly pulled off a major upset. It seems like in these special elections, in these off-cycle elections, in these periods where you need voters to turn out, Democrats now have an advantage, and I think it's an education advantage and probably a motivation advantage.
Yeah, and the thing about special elections is they usually just behave like ordinary open seats, right? But we got shifts going on in the electorate in terms of how preferences operate for both parties. So seeing this kind of narrowing of the gap in a special open seat, I think you can give more credence to that now in the U.S. than we would have, say, 15 years ago when we said, just ordinary forces are at work. No, there's something else going on. But the thing is it a mobilization piece or is it actually a referendum piece? In either instance, it presents a challenge for Republicans because the GOP is increasingly relying on low propensity voters in elections. And in states like Ohio, where another chunk of their demographic is actually dying out, right? That could present a real problem, real challenge. So either way, no matter how these function, it does signal a challenge for the GOP in holding the House. That, along with the redistricting changes, in several states.
Yeah, and it also tells us something about what we know about the world and how our knowledge of the world changes over time, because once upon a time when we were teaching classes, we were teaching that low turnout races helped Republicans because they were the party of business, they were the party of higher income. They were also they had more of an advantage among college educated voters. Today, that is not clearly the case. The Democratic Party is definitely the party of a college educated voter. The Republican Party, as you said, is the less attentive voters who maybe they need someone at the top of the ticket to really draw them out.
Yeah, and the GOP they are relying on low information voters, low propensity voters, low education, white, male, but also people who tend to get married, stay married, and also fit this profile, right? And that means that their demographic profile is drifting away from the newer voters that are coming in, but also away from the high propensity voters. And this helps reinforce this cultural divide that's at the foundation of American politics still. Yeah.
Yeah, and we're starting to run out of time, but there was one more thing I want to throw at you very quickly, and then we'll wrap for this particular segment. But the vice presidential sweepstakes on the Trump side is getting highly entertaining. It seems like Trump is looking for someone who won't be too challenging.
Well, that's, if you look at the history of the Trump organization, it's about finding competent lapdogs, right? Trying to find somebody who's competent but compliant. And so you have to find somebody who has enough ambition to want to be VP and enough ability. And let's remember that Sarah Palin's the baseline for the GOP in doing all this right now, okay? Yep. But somebody who meets those minimum criteria, but also isn't going to rock the boat and is going to do what they're told. And is also at risk ruining their entire political future in politics, right? Yep. So it's a tough proposition to find somebody out there. And you look at the names that are floating around. Yeah, it's a mighty narrow search. I mean, they're sitting here and they're talking about J.D. Vance. Okay.
Yeah.
J.D. Vance, who wrote one piece of mediocre sociology. Actually, he's an interesting guy to sit down and just have a drink with and to eat with. Okay, and he is a Marine, but man, there's not executive function there. There's not a guy there who you want to have as the next in line. But he's the kind of guy that's going to end up on the short list because he fits all the criteria.
Yeah, and it seems like it's interesting looking at their description of what they're looking for. It almost seems like they want Mike Pence, but Mike Pence who didn't follow the Constitution at the end of the day. So anyway, that's it for the time on the Quick Bites. We're going to come back to the main course, and we're going to do a deep dive on congressional elections and Southern politics with our guest and my good friend Keith Gaddy.
Aggieland now has its own cooking competition as Texas A&M's best chefs compete for the crown in Aggie Chef Showdown. From deconstructed enchiladas to Maryland crab cakes, each chef brings flavors from their childhood to the kitchen. With an hour on the clock and 3 hungry judges waiting, which dish will win? Stream anytime on KAMU's YouTube channel.
Hi, it's Robin Young, host of Here and Now. No medium reports breaking news better than public radio. You can rely on KAMU to provide live news programs throughout your workday. And now, Here and Now is available at 11 a.m. We'll update you on the news you heard earlier in the day, and just as important, we'll report on breaking news. And all of it is fact-based and in-depth. Listen to Here and Now at our new time, weekdays at 11 on Aggieland's Public Radio, KAMU-FM.
All right, it's on to the main course. We want to talk a little bit about congressional elections. We spent a lot of time on this program talking about presidential elections, but Congress is important. Congress and the Senate and control of Congress and the Senate. And both the U.S. House and the U.S. Senate are up for grabs this year. Got any predictions on that, Keith?
Well, the Democrats look like they've got a tough field to defend in the Senate, right? So getting to a tie or even a -1 is a very high probability because, in a way, they're trying to pick up the Arizona seat that's held by their party defecting independent who has decided to opt out, Kristen Sinema. So they've got to hold on to that seat. And Arizona is always a dicey thing because it's a swing state. They're banking on trying to make pickups in places like Texas, where I think they got their best shot in a while with Colin Allred. But I think the House flips irrespective of national tides, because where the vulnerabilities exist are in places where the seats themselves are not really subject to a lot of swings. You've got this redistricting in several states that deal with voting rights that create actually enough seats to flip the House if they go and everything else holds constant. You got maybe 20, 25 toss-up seats in the entire country. All you have to do is win 12 out of 22, and you're in control. And I think that's well within the reach of the Democrats, especially if they run as actual Democrats, which means they run on roads, schools, and jobs, right? And they seem capable of doing that. So that's my take right now.
Yeah. So one of the super interesting things about the House and the Senate, one, you hit on a couple of really great points. One is what we've seen in the House is a decline in the number of competitive seats over time. So once upon a time, we could talk about having 60, maybe 80 even competitive seats, but probably more in the range of 60. Yeah. Now we're talking about 20. We're talking about control of the U.S. House of Representatives coming down to really a handful of seats, because the other seats are no longer competitive because they are drawn to voters. And you hear people say this sometimes. Once upon a time, voters chose the politicians. Now the politicians are choosing their voters. Mm-hmm. And you've played around in that space, huh? For the audience, Keith is among his many talents, he's also an expert in gerrymandering and has done some work in this space.
No matter who your Satan is in politics, I probably worked with them on the left or the right. I was in Texas, I was in Wisconsin, I was in Florida, I was in Georgia, New Mexico, Oklahoma, you name it, I've probably been there. But yeah, the thing is, the voters have also made it easy. Bill Bishop up in Austin wrote that book, The Big Sword.
Yeah.
We're all clustering together, so it's easier to corral us and lasso us and create safe seats because we're voting with our feet. We're voting for our neighbors based upon who we are. So all of us college professors, we go to these places with good restaurants and almost affordable housing, right? And then we cluster together and we enjoy it and try and find somebody who's center or left of center to vote for. But the problem is two things. One is, we're drawing these districts and we're drawing them with laser precision, right? We got great computing behind this, right? Incredible technology. We also don't have enough members of Congress. The districts are simply too dang populous, right? We need to have a Congress with about 650 members in it, which is the same size as the British Parliament, right? It's a number that'll work. The districts get down to a reasonable size. And by definition, you'll end up with more competitive districts simply because of the way the geography plays. Yeah. And voters will be a little bit closer to the representative, but it's not in our control.
Yeah, but and it's also I have been making that case in my classes and trying to make the argument that maybe we should. People talked about packing the courts. Let's pack the Congress. Let's expand the number of districts. Let's create more local districts. It's not something that people think about naturally. It's not something that seems to sell very well as a political idea, as a reform idea. You want more? You want more of those people?
Well, what I want to do is I'd be willing to trade in 50% of the staff to get there. Okay.
Yeah.
Let's make these guys write their own mail. Okay. It's not that hard. The rest of us do it. They can handle this thing. But no, the idea of making more of those jobs and more of these BS jobs that are out there, the electorate will never go for that. My gosh, look at the Texas Senate. A Texas Senate district has 1 million people in it. Mm-hmm. It's insane. Yeah. It's insane. It's entirely too big a constituency. But no, the public won't go for it because the public doesn't care for elites and actually don't care for politics. And that's not entirely a bad thing to be skeptical of politics, because there are other things we should be doing. But it would be nice to have a functional legislature and a responsive one. Yeah,
the other challenge that happens as you narrow the number of competitive districts is if I'm the incumbent now, instead of worrying about, I'm the Republican and Keith Gaddy, the Democrat, might challenge me, now I'm worried Keith Gaddy, the Republican's going to run to the right of me, and the same thing works on the left. You have to worry more about internal Democratic or Republican politics than you do about the general election, which pushes the parties towards the extremes.
Yeah, and this really is the durable problem, right?
Yeah.
And especially in your one-party states where there's just no responsiveness whatsoever. This is, I used to really be opposed to term limits, and now I'm starting to think that two things we need is maybe we do need to have some periodic turnover,
Yeah.
and we also need multi-member districts. That if we're going to have big districts, let's elect multiple members from them and get a diversity of voices out of a constituency and maybe allow a little more ambition, have a little more access. But the extremism, the closed primaries, this system where most choices are made absent most voters, campaign season gets longer and longer thanks to things like the MOVE Act. So now we have to have 2 months between every election. So if you're a runoff state like we are, it's a 6-month campaign season at a minimum from
Right.
filing. And it's just exhausting. It's exhausting. And, by the time voters are paying attention, the decisions have been made.
Yeah. And it's a 6-month campaign season on a 2-year term. And so you're just constantly running for office. You're constantly thinking, I don't like to think about the good old days because I'm not sure they were so good for everyone. But there was a period where you thought, okay, the election's over. Now it's the time that we govern.
Right.
And increasingly, this is more than just what's going on in the campaigns. And when the primaries are, it's also about media. It's also about social media and digital life and everything else that's going on. The permanent campaign, which we've talked about for decades, is even more permanent. It's more constant. It's more about being on the right side of maybe a Twitter mob or on the right side of a social media group and not actually getting anything done. So we're frustrated with our Congress for not solving enough problems, and our members aren't trying to solve problems because they'd much rather make statements and be visible.
Yeah, and part of this also is it's hyperwar. Okay, this concept of hyperwar, fast-moving, constant war, right?
Yeah.
If you look at what's going on in our politics right now, we have a Congress. We talked about the age disconnect. There's also the lifestyle disconnect. If you're in the Tuesday, Thursday club, so you're on a plane at ungodly AM Tuesday night or late Monday night, early Tuesday morning, you're bugging out on Thursday. You're constantly bouncing back and forth, right, in your commute. But then while you're in Washington, 1 in 4 members of Congress are sleeping in their office.
Yeah.
Let's think about that. You never leave work. You never leave work. You never get out of that little bubble you're operating in, even in DC. And it's a constant input and output of what's coming across on Drudge or Twitter or Bluesky or whatever it is you're following. And it's hyperwar all the time. And it's not like life for the rest of us. It's not like life for how we engage in it. And so you end up with a bunch of politicians. We had mentioned this off air. It's like the old sort of the French politician sitting on the Champs-Élysées who sees a crowd go right by, goes, there goes my people. I must find out where they're going so I can lead them.
Yeah.
That is to be a party leader anymore.
Yeah.
It used to be that Washington had this at least sophisticated and dignified lifestyle that had families and it had a seasonal rhythm to it rather than a daily or a weekly or an hourly rhythm.
Well, and on the
part of our general challenge as people.
Yeah, and on the Republican side, being a leader, I think, is harder than even chasing after the crowd, because as soon as you're leading the crowd, they're shouting off with their heads. They're part of the establishment now. We need to get rid of them. So you get rid of Kevin McCarthy. You get a Mike Johnson in, and then you're ready to overturn him as well. And it gets harder and harder to lead a party that is, at least part of the party, is strongly rooted in this anti-establishment. If you're part of the establishment, you're part of the problem, and that makes it difficult to govern.
Well, and that's the metaphor used to be that in politics, the job was capture the flag, right? Play ground game, capture the flag, get your position, run up, grab the flag, you win. Well, now it's that other game you and I used to play growing up in Kentucky. Kill the guy with the ball. That's the game we play. Hey, here's the ball. You're the leader. Kill the guy with the ball.
Yeah.
And it really is a problem, because I think inside the elites, as a general rule, they don't take the kill. I don't think they take this killing that seriously. But the problem is the crowd does. The
Yeah.
crowd does. And there's a sufficient number of people out there that make it truly dangerous. And Kirby, for folks that haven't read our stuff, which is almost all of humanity, this is what we deal with, right?
Right.
Is trust, civility, and how to have a functioning civil democracy.
Mm-hmm.
Yet we keep feeding these small, dangerous threats. They're a threat in the public space. They're a threat to elites. They're a threat in communication. And they threaten to capture the entire political discourse because the elites are afraid to stand up and act on principle and say, just shut up.
Yeah.
And so we're stuck.
And the elites in many cases can't do that, or they're no longer, they lose their position of authority and power. But I want to go back to the idea of—
Wait, you meant authority?
Yeah, like
power.
Yes. It's Keith has been a department chair. I've been a department chair. The funny things about in an academic setting is department chairs have almost no authority. I think it's one of the most difficult jobs to do. And what they've done is they've taken the Speaker of the House and they've made them a department chair, where it's very hard to have any real authority and really any control in order to move your department ahead.
My most important tool was my rubber stamp. I can tell you that right now. Yeah. Yeah. But, the thing is, though, I'll credit the Republican leadership in a couple of places. McCarthy did this without principle, but Johnson actually has done this with credibility. Yeah. Bipartisan coalitions are back, baby. Someone decided maybe we actually ought to govern.
Yes.
And I think we're just lucky with Mike Johnson that he's kind of like Charlie Wilson was. He's from a district where his constituents don't know and they don't care. Right? They like him and it'll be okay.
Yeah, and him having the credibility on the side of his party believing that he was an honest broker, even if they didn't always agree with him, helped him survive the leadership challenge that Kevin McCarthy couldn't get through because his party didn't believe he was being an honest broker. And then the Democrats saw no reason at all to help him, and Democrats said, well, Mike Johnson may be problematic in a lot of ways, but he has been straightforward in terms of how he's dealing with this. That doesn't please everyone, and you still have that fringe group out there trying to depose you.
Yeah.
And
the bizarre thing, most of these guys in this majority were recruited by McCarthy and by Paul Ryan and by Eric Cantor, all of whom got run out of Congress by the people they brought in. They got run out by their own people.
Yeah.
And it's absurd. It's absurd, but it is the politics we exist in.
Yeah.
And
yeah, one of the things I want is the House looks like it might go, probably, if I had to bet, and I think if you had to bet right now, you'd bet it's going to go Democratic. At the presidential level, I don't know how I would bet. I might just flip a coin and take the winner, but let's give Trump the advantage for the second, just because of polling, and say you have an advantage for the Republicans at the presidential level. You have an advantage for the House. At the Democratic advantage in the House. And then in the Senate, it looks like the Senate's probably going to go Republican unless they shoot themselves in the foot again, which Republicans have been very good at by nominating candidates who ended up being really problematic. But it looks like they may have learned their lesson in this particular cycle. And so we are likely moving from mixed government to a different form of divided government.
Yeah, and it's all a question of where you want to have your gridlock happen, right? You get the Senate and the presidency. Okay, you can nominate judges. Congratulations. You've got the House, the presidency. You might be able to get a budget. Pick, right? You might be able to cut taxes. But if the Democrats have the House, one thing you can bank on is the budget's not going to change. The tax code's not going to change, right? Yeah. And this is always the thing that GOP elite is concerned with is those things. Well, now that Roe's dead, it's hard to play judicial politics the way you used to. It's just not that critical to evangelical voters anymore, nominations. So I'm not sure where you get your play in the Senate.
Right.
As much, but it's just frustrating because nobody seems to be able to articulate an agenda for the future and then act on it, right? And that doesn't mean something grand and progressive and different. It just means something coherent. Right. Rather than just kind of limping along and continuing to govern one crisis at a time. But, then again, most of the constituents are living paycheck to paycheck anyway. So maybe as voters, we can relate to it because we have no vision, we have no sense of the future either.
Yeah. Yeah.
And that's one thing we actually do know from the survey data and other sources of information is there's not a lot of faith in the future.
Yeah.
And most people are not expecting the things that have been promised by nearly a century of New Deal programs to be around for them. We're looking for a new political norm to operate in, a new narrative. The World War II narrative has run out.
Yeah.
And we don't know what our new narrative looks like. And we need something. We need something to be the foundation of America that's more than yelling at the Olympics.
Yeah, and neither party at this point has really put forward a compelling sort of big vision picture. And some people may take issue with that. They say, well, Biden is the pro-democracy candidate, or Trump is the populist candidate. But in both cases, it seems more. It doesn't even seem to rise to the level of, say, Ronald Reagan trying to bring back smaller government and return power to the states. There doesn't seem to be a theory behind what the parties are looking to do and accomplish it, other than to beat the other side.
Yeah, and winning for winning's sake isn't enough. It's not enough. You want to do something with the thing when you catch it, right? And you want to do something that's good for posterity.
Yeah.
And the other problem we're getting into is the denigration of credibility of electoral institutions and democratic institutions is now creeping over into business, industry, sports, a variety of places. No one has confidence in anything right now.
Yeah.
And we have to find something to stand on, something for a foundation. And it's even if government's small, we still want to have confidence in it, that it can deal with the big problems when they happen and use the new tools.
Yeah, and you mentioned sports, and one of the things that I've really liked that I've seen over the last couple of years is Michael Lewis had a podcast called Against the Rules, where he talks about the fact that we don't have confidence in neutral arbitrators anymore, and because of that makes it very difficult to have trust in political processes. So you just simply don't trust referees, as an example. Because you don't trust that they're going to make the right call. And then we think, we're going to do something to make it more trustworthy, we'll make the process more transparent, we'll make it more clear. And that doesn't seem to work either. So in sports, you bring in video and allow video review, but does that make people happier with the referees? In politics, you make the process more transparent. You make sure that people are more accessible and you can see them at all times and you can respond to them at all times. But does that make the process better? And it's not clear that it does.
No, and the thing is, you don't necessarily want everything to be visible. Sometimes you need to make deals in the back room. You need to negotiate to get to the outcome that everybody's going to like. And the tools of how we talk, you're not going to like them. You're not going to like them much. The truth is that for a politician, you actually need to be able to talk ill of your constituency to convince the other guy to come to the table and work with you and get something for your constituency.
Yeah.
And it's a sad thing. And, Kirby, this is, my next book is on college football championships. I actually don't like the playoff. Right. I think we should just have the writers and the coaches vote at the end of the year and then argue about it. It works as well as anything.
You're hurting me there, Keith, and you completely undermine my own argument there. So
you can still have the NCAA
if it goes to the playoff,
then it's fine.
Yeah.
Well, so we can argue with the 12th and 13th team.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. But we talked about so the Senate may be leaning Republican. Part of that is because Democrats have to defend more seats, and if you look at the seats that they're defending, they have more toss-up seats that they're defending. Well, they have one seat they've almost certainly lost for all the ill that was directed at Joe Manchin in West Virginia. That seat it would be shocking for the Republican Party not to pick up the seat, and mostly people are just counting it on the Republican side. So that's one seat gone, and then you have a number of other seats. You mentioned Arizona. People also, were very critical of cinema there, and it looks like that's at least in play. It's not clear that that seat will be a pickup for the Republicans, but it looks like the field is tilted to the Republican Party, just given which 34 seats are up in this particular election cycle.
Well, exactly. And, it used to be, if you look at the West, the American West is defined by the post-Civil War settlement of the West, which is shaped by Reconstruction and by Southerners, okay? The American West is a Southern product, okay? And Democrats have almost no shot out there beyond Montana and Colorado. That's about it. But it used to be that in Arkansas, Tennessee, Kentucky, and West Virginia, Democrats had a real shot due to manufacturing, unionization, things like that. But what's funny is if you look at all the South, the places where the biggest realignment happened in state legislatures and just went radical crazy in the last 8 years going to the right are those 4 states. Mm-hmm. West Virginia was solidly Democratic. The bottom dropped out. They went rock solid GOP. Manchin may be the last registered Democrat in the state. We don't know, okay? But Arkansas had the same path. Tennessee did the same thing. Kentucky did the same thing. Something happened after about 2015, towards the end of Obama's term, where they just went radically over. And it is that populism. It is that white Christian conservatism. It's a variety of factors, but all shoved over. That's 8 seats the Democrats need to just write off for probably a generation.
Yeah, and you mentioned Kentucky, and for the truth in advertising, Keith and I are both Kentuckians by birth, but Kentucky has a remarkable Democratic governor there who's proven to be highly effective in a Republican state. But that's unusual all by itself, and it's earning some national acclaim. But it's hard to replicate these individuals. I don't know if you call them. I don't know if you want to call them black swan politicians, but the Andy Beshears in Kentucky, the Joe Manchins in West Virginia, people who can win in places just purely because they're incredibly gifted politicians working against a partisan tide that seems like they should never be able to win.
Yeah, and that's, and Andy Beshear is the kind of Democrat that can win, but the problem is you got to get him out of a primary in the Democratic Party nationally.
Yes.
And that's always a problem. But if you look at the Democratic record of winning the presidency, and Barack Obama was unique, right?
Yeah.
But going back, all the way back to the 1980s, when the Democrats win, they're winning with guys like Andy Beshear. It's Biden, it's Clinton. It's these practical centrists who will take care of the left-leaning issues and take care of the working man. But you can't get them nominated anymore.
Yeah, it's one of my big regrets about contemporary politics. I like blue state Republicans. Larry Hogan, who we haven't mentioned, could potentially put Maryland in play. Maryland is a state that no Republican should be able to win in. He won as governor. He's a popular former governor. Yep. Great, gifted politician. I would love to see him run for president on the Republican side against an Andy Beshear on the Democratic side. But as you said, it's so hard to imagine anybody coming at those two candidates possibly coming out of a primary. It's just it's hard to even think about.
And so why don't we just lay something to bed right now for the rest of the season? You're not going to get cross-party unity tickets. Independents don't win because all the talent and all the money is behind the ambition machine of the party organizations, okay? So as we get talking about whatever new novel thing that's got the maths behind it, and I don't even know what that would be right now, no, it's not going to happen. It's going to be one of these two guys, or if one of these two guys dies, it's going to be whoever the party put in their place. That's it. Pay no attention to the distraction over here of Robert Kennedy Jr., okay? Yeah. It's a distraction. He'll get 3.2% of the vote.
Yeah, and we always sort of hope for that thing, that the mythical, knight on a white horse or whatever coming in and saving the day, and it's just not going to happen. The politics aren't laid out that way, and the primary processes aren't laid out that way. And even recently, you've heard some people, I think Nate Silver is one of them, saying maybe it's time for Joe Biden to step aside. Well, here's the thing. Joe Biden won by the rules that were in place. And so you can't just make him step aside because you're not happy with him, because there was a process and he came out of the process, and he, maybe then we need to rethink the process which I'd be up for, but we're not going to fix we can't fix it last minute unless for some reason he just decided to step aside. Real quick, we're starting to run out of time, but I did want you to. We have talked a little bit about the Texas Senate race.
Yeah.
And
I'll give you a quick take on it to wrap things up. I was down at South Padre for a few days, and I happened to come in, turn on the game, seeing some commercials, and I had to go back and double check that Colin Allred was a Democrat. I mean, it's remarkable. He pitches well. He plays well. He knows how to effortlessly land on the key GOP issue and make it work. Ted Cruz probably wins, but man, if you had a choice between Colin Allred or Ted Cruz and your only issue is the border, go with the guy who went to Baylor. It's he'll be he's better at it. He's better at it.
Yeah, and there is this reality of, if you look at sort of Biden versus Democrats generally, especially on the Democratic side, Biden is consistently running in state races behind the state nominees. And that's really telling. But part of what is going on is exactly what you mentioned here. There are a number of candidates who have made a very clear effort to separate themselves from Joe Biden and say, yes, I'm running, but I stood up to Joe Biden and I fought for the border. And it's a really interesting thing that's going on, and you can tell a lot about politics by watching these Senate election campaign ads and seeing how they're positioning themselves relative to the nominee of the party. And on the Democratic side, there has clearly been an effort to distance themselves from Biden so that they can stand on their own. And you mentioned earlier, run on the local issues, run on roads and jobs, and when they're doing that, they're doing pretty well.
It'll bring you home every time.
Well, Keith, we need to start wrapping up here. So, what's your parting shot? What do you have for us to think about as we go forward into this election cycle?
Honestly, if I were a voter, I know that the media people don't want to hear this, but just turn everything off till about October 15th. Go watch football. Seriously, nothing's going to change. Nothing's going to change. Go lead life. It'll be here when you come back. Except you should watch this podcast every week.
Yeah, and absolutely watch the podcast, and also, but your advice is good, because one of the things that happens is you can get easily caught up in the 24/7 of politics. This is what the 24/7 news channels do on both the left and the right. They play to your anxiety, they play to your outrage, and they get you upset about things, and they add to the polarization of the political process because they're not going deep like we're going deep on the deep dive. So, thanks,
exactly.
Keith, for being here today. That's episode 6 of Inside Political Science. Thanks to our audience. Please join us and continue to send your questions and your thoughts and suggestions to insidepoli.tamu.edu. Thanks, everyone.
Inside Political Science is a production from KAMU, Aggieland's Public Television and Radio. For more information, visit tx.ag/Inside Political Science. Have a question for our experts? Email them at insidepoli@tamu.edu. Also, subscribe to the show on your favorite podcast platform so you never miss a new episode.